Most people don't notice the exact moment when something inside them breaks. It doesn't always come with shouting or slamming doors. It isn't always loud. Sometimes it happens in silence, during a long drive home, a conversation that feels hollow, or a single glance in the mirror that feels unfamiliar. The shift is subtle, but real. The center no longer holds. The self that used to rise and carry everything starts to slip away, too tired to pretend anymore. I'm the midnight voice, and this is wisdom while you sleep, where each story helps you drift off a little wiser. If this space brings you a little comfort tonight, feel free to like the video and subscribe, only if it truly helps. And by the way, I always love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. Share your location and the time where you are. Now, let's begin. It's often the smallest things that push a person over the edge. A dropped glass, a late reply, a missed appointment. But those small things aren't what caused the break. They just reveal that the person was already holding far too much. The smile was real, perhaps. The effort, genuine. But beneath it all was a quiet exhaustion that had been building for years. They tried to be everything for everyone. The reliable one, the patient one, the one who doesn't ask for much. Maybe they were the one who always answered the call, even when they were barely holding themselves together. Or maybe they were the strong one, the one who never cried, who always knew what to do. But even strength has a weight. And sometimes, when no one is looking, it becomes too much. The breaking doesn't look the same for everyone. For some, it comes as tears they can't control. For others, it's a kind of numbness, a quiet shutting down where even simple things feel impossibly hard. Some people snap, others slowly fold inward. But the result is the same. The version of themselves they once knew no longer works. There's a strange moment when this happens. A kind of drifting. They go through the motions, still showing up, still responding. But inside, it feels like something has slipped out of place. The mind wanders more. The body feels heavier. They wonder why they feel disconnected from others, from themselves, from life. They start saying, "I'm fine," less convincingly. And then, the questions begin to echo louder. Why do I always feel like I'm not enough? Why do I say yes when I'm exhausted? Why do I feel guilty when I rest? The questions aren't new, but now they demand answers. And in the quiet that follows a personal breaking, there's finally enough space to hear them. Often, this stage is misunderstood. People on the outside might not even notice. They might still see someone who's functional, who's doing okay. But what they don't see is the emotional weight that's no longer being managed. The constant inner calculations of what's expected, what's allowed, what won't make waves. The person who breaks is not weak. They're not dramatic. They're simply human. And they've run out of places to hide their pain. There's something profoundly disorienting about this stage. They might feel guilt for not being able to keep going the way they used to. Shame, even. They might feel like they're letting others down, or that they're becoming someone they no longer recognize. But that disorientation is part of the process. Breaking isn't the end. It's the moment the old way stops working. And somewhere, beneath all the discomfort, there's a flicker of possibility. A whisper that says, maybe there's another way to live. But at first, that whisper is hard to hear. In the early days of breaking, most people don't look for lessons. They just try to survive, to rest, to breathe without crying, to go a whole hour without feeling overwhelmed. The body becomes more aware of how tense it's been. The mind begins to notice how many thoughts are rooted in fear or perfectionism. These aren't insights, they're just facts that had been buried under the pressure to keep going. There may be dreams that feel distant now, ambitions that used to fuel them, but now seem irrelevant or exhausting. Relationships that feel one-sided, conversations they no longer have the energy to maintain. And the world doesn't pause when someone breaks. It just keeps spinning. So the person learns to move slowly, cautiously, finding new rhythms in a life that now feels unfamiliar. Some people retreat, needing space. Others seek out quiet connections. People who won't judge, who will sit with them without needing them to be cheerful or productive. And in those quiet moments, they begin to notice what they hadn't before, how much they've been carrying, how little they've been receiving, how rare it is to simply feel seen. Breaking doesn't destroy a person. It exposes what can no longer continue. It's not a failure, it's an opening. But that's not how it feels at first. In the beginning, it just feels like loss. The loss of certainty. The loss of who they thought they had to be. And yet, this is where healing begins. Not with fixing, not with quick solutions, but with the simple, aching truth. I can't do this anymore. Not like this. And for the first time, that truth is allowed to exist. For most of their life, they were told to be strong. Maybe not in those words, but in the way people praised their resilience, in the way they were admired for pushing through or keeping it together. And for a while, it worked. Strength became their armor, an identity, a role, even a form of value. The world smiled at their strength, so they offered more of it. They became the dependable one, the calm one, the one who doesn't make things harder for anyone else. But strength, as many discovered too late, can also become a trap. When a person breaks, they often look back and realize just how many times they said yes when they were drowning, how many times they said I'm okay when they were anything but. The illusion of strength isn't just about appearing tough, it's about losing touch with what's real. It's about performing wellness while neglecting the quiet, desperate needs underneath. People don't always know how much they've abandoned themselves until the breaking point comes. And suddenly, the strength they were praised for feels like a lie. Not because they weren't strong, but because they thought strength meant never resting, never needing help, never admitting fear. They wore their emotional silence like a medal. But now, that silence feels cold, lonely, exhausting. The applause for being so strong begins to ring hollow. This is one of the hardest lessons, realizing that the image others loved wasn't the full self. That being seen as capable often came at the cost of being seen as human. And so, when they fall apart, it's not just the stress or the fatigue, it's the grief of having been invisible. Not to others, necessarily, but to themselves. Strength, real strength, begins to take a new shape here. It stops being about holding everything in. It stops being about smiling through pain. It becomes something softer, quieter. Strength becomes the ability to say, I'm not okay today. To rest without guilt. To ask for support without shame. It becomes the bravery to be seen as someone who feels deeply. And this shift doesn't happen all at once. It comes slowly, like morning light. First, there's the discomfort, the urge to go back to the old performance, to pretend again, to apologize for breaking. But gradually, they start to test a new way of being. They start to say no to things they would have forced themselves through before. They start to tell the truth, not to everyone, but maybe to one or two people who feel safe. And when they do, something surprising happens. The world doesn't fall apart. The people worth keeping don't walk away. They lean in, they understand, or at least they try to. And in those moments, the person begins to learn what they were never taught. That vulnerability isn't weakness. That tears don't erase dignity. That needing others is not a flaw. They also begin to see strength in places they never thought to look. In someone who rests when they're tired. In someone who admits when they're lost. In someone who chooses a quieter life, not because they gave up, but because they finally realized how much noise they were carrying. There's strength in the mother who sits in her car an extra 5 minutes just to breathe. In the man who says, "I can't do this anymore," and means it. In the friend who stops trying to fix everyone else's pain and starts tending to their own. And with this new perspective, the person begins to grieve the old version of themselves. The version who always said yes, who made jokes to hide the heaviness, who wore their independence like a mask. It's not that this version was wrong or bad. That self got them through. That self survived. But now, they want to live differently. There's also a deep sadness that comes with realizing how long they misunderstood what strength really was. How many times they pushed themselves when rest would have been wiser. How many emotions they buried to appear composed. How many people they supported while silently falling apart. This sadness is necessary. It doesn't ask for blame. It just asks to be felt. And in feeling it, they make room for something new. Slowly, they begin to build a different kind of life. Not one built on proving their worth through exhaustion, but one built on honesty. They start honoring their energy. They let some things fall away. Maybe they stop responding to every message right away. Maybe they spend more time alone. Not because they're isolating, but because they're learning how to hear themselves again. This version of strength is less visible. There's no applause, no praise. But it's solid, quiet, grounded. And something remarkable happens when a person starts living from this place. They begin to recognize others who've been through the same thing. They spot the softness in someone's eyes, the pause before someone speaks, the gentleness of someone who's learned not to judge. They start surrounding themselves with people who value presence over performance. People who understand silence, who don't need explanations, who've also learned the hard way that you don't need to break yourself to be loved. And maybe, for the first time, the person feels seen, not for what they do, but for who they are. Not for how strong they appear, but for how tender they've become. After the breaking, after the masks fall and the illusion of strength begins to dissolve, there is often a stretch of time that feels like nothingness. No drive, no clarity, no rush to rebuild, just space. The kind that feels unfamiliar at first, unstructured, still. A kind of emotional quiet that doesn't feel peaceful right away. More like standing in the ruins of a life that once made sense. This is the part most people don't talk about. The middle. Not the fall, not the rise, but the long, slow in-between. The days when they wake up and don't know what they want. When conversations feel like echoes. When they don't even recognize their own thoughts. There's no dramatic sadness, just a quiet flatness, like everything has been muted. And yet, in that muted silence, something important begins to unfold. They start noticing the world differently, noticing how loud everything used to be, how fast they were living, how much of their day was dictated by obligations, expectations, noise. The absence of those things now feels both disorienting and relieving, like taking off a heavy coat they didn't realize they were wearing. They sit longer with their coffee. They stop rushing through meals. They read a paragraph twice, not because they're distracted, but because they want to feel it. These small pauses aren't forced. They happen naturally, as if the body itself is learning to breathe differently. It's not healing yet, exactly. It's something simpler, a kind of listening. The mind, after so long performing and planning and protecting, starts to soften. Old memories resurface, not the painful ones, necessarily, but the quiet ones. A laugh shared years ago. The way sunlight hit the floor in a place they once called home. These flashes aren't loud, but they come with a feeling. A reminder that life isn't always heavy. But they don't rush toward meaning yet. They don't try to build a new identity or find some grand lesson. Not here. This is the part where they just exist, where they feel the tiredness in their bones and let themselves be tired, where they stop forcing smiles and stop apologizing for the space they take up, where they look out a window and let their mind drift without pulling it back. They might still cry sometimes, or feel waves of frustration, or suddenly miss someone they never thought they'd think of again. But the emotions come with more space now. They aren't squeezed into the corners of a busy life. They're allowed to stretch out, to be felt fully, without explanation. It's in this stretch of stillness that clarity begins to whisper. Not in bold revelations or grand ideas, but in subtle feelings. That friend who always leaves them drained, they think of them less. That job that once felt impressive, they start wondering why it mattered so much. That version of life they were chasing, it starts to lose its grip. And in its place, something else begins to emerge. Fragile, at first. A quiet preference. A new kind of honesty. A growing awareness of what actually feels good. Not what looks good or sounds impressive, but what feels right. Maybe it's choosing solitude over social pressure, or choosing to speak up instead of staying agreeable, or simply choosing to do nothing at all, and letting that be enough. In the gentle ruins, people start to remember who they were before the world told them who to be. They remember the kid who used to draw for hours, the teenager who felt things deeply and didn't yet know how to hide it. The person who once said no without guilt and yes with excitement. These memories aren't about nostalgia, they're about return. The beginning of coming home to themselves. And yet, this stage can also feel lonely. The world keeps asking, what's next? But they don't have an answer. Not yet, and that's okay. Because rushing would only rebuild the same patterns. The same performance. So they learn to stay here, in the quiet, in the not knowing, trusting, slowly, that not all progress looks like motion. Sometimes, the deepest shifts happen in stillness. And in that stillness, they begin to see themselves not as someone who broke, but as someone who endured. Someone who cared so much, they forgot themselves. Who loved so deeply, they lost their voice. Who gave so fully, they ran dry. And now, piece by piece, they're reclaiming those parts, not to return to who they were, but to become someone new, someone honest, someone whole. They realize they don't want to be admired anymore. They want to be understood, not for their achievements or their strength, but for their softness, for the quiet truths they've learned, for the way they've learned to stay when things get hard, and to leave when something hurts too much. And so, they remain here a while longer, in the ruins, not broken, not lost, just becoming, eventually. Something begins to stir, quiet at first, almost like instinct. It comes in the form of discomfort when someone asks for more than they should. A hesitation before agreeing to something that feels heavy. A small voice inside that says, "No more." Not like that. It's not loud, not yet, but it's there, and it's new. For many people, the moment they break is also the moment they realize how often they've been crossing their own boundaries. Not maliciously, not even consciously, but out of habit, out of fear, out of love. They've been saying yes while their body whispered no. They've been making space for others without checking if they had any space left for themselves. Breaking strips away the ability to ignore this, because now, even small violations feel unbearable. What used to be tolerated now feels like poison. What used to be manageable now makes them feel like they're drowning. It's not because they're fragile. It's because they're finally awake. There's grief here, too. A grief that comes from realizing how long they've been teaching others, through silence, through compliance, that it was okay to overstep, that they would always be available, always agreeable, always okay. But now, something has shifted. They no longer want to be easy to be around if it costs them their peace. And so, the first boundaries begin to form, not as walls, but as quiet lines drawn in tired sand. They might not know how to speak them aloud at first. Maybe they just begin by delaying their responses, taking longer to reply to a message, saying, "Let me think about it," instead of rushing into another yes. They start checking in with themselves before committing. It's a small act, but it changes everything. Because, for the first time, they're asking themselves, do I have the energy for this? Do I want to do this? Will this leave me drained or nourished? And these questions aren't selfish. They're essential. They're how a person begins to shift from living reactively to living intentionally, from being available for everyone to being available for themselves. Boundaries don't always make life easier at first. In fact, they often make things harder. The people who benefited from the old version may resist. They may guilt. They may question. And that's where the next lesson arrives. Boundaries don't just protect peace. They reveal who respects it. Sometimes, the first firm boundary leads to a confrontation, or distance, or silence. But none of that is proof that the boundary was wrong. It's proof that it was needed. And it's in these moments, these difficult, honest moments, that a person begins to understand something deeper. Love doesn't always look like sacrifice. Respect doesn't come from overextending. And being kind doesn't mean being endlessly available. They stop mistaking guilt for a signal to go back. And instead, they start seeing it for what it is, a remnant of an old story. One where their worth was tied to what they could offer. One where rest had to be earned, where saying no felt dangerous. That story begins to unravel. And in its place, a new story takes shape. One where no is not rejection, but a form of self-trust. One where rest is not laziness, but wisdom. One where they no longer explain every decision, because they know that clarity doesn't always require permission. Boundaries, over time, begin to feel less like fences and more like invitations. They don't say, "Stay away." They say, "Here's how to be close to me in a way that doesn't harm either of us." They say, "This is how I protect what matters. This is how I stay whole." And slowly, life begins to respond. Some people drift away because they know that clarity doesn't always require permission. More thoughtfully, more honestly, conversations deepen. There's more space to breathe. Relationships become less about performance and more about presence. Less about keeping the peace and more about building real connection. And something else happens, too. The person begins to see the boundaries of others, not as rejection, but as truth. They become better at listening, at accepting, at respecting a no without needing it to be softened. Because they've done the hard work themselves. They've felt the fear of setting limits, and now they know how brave it is. They also begin to feel safer inside themselves. Not because life is easier, but because they know they won't abandon themselves again. Not for approval, not for convenience, not even for love. That promise, quiet and personal, is one of the greatest forms of healing. Not needing the world to adjust, but knowing that they can choose differently now. Knowing they don't have to explain every feeling. That discomfort is part of growth. That peace is a practice, not a prize. And when someone asks too much now, they don't need to panic. They just pause. They breathe. They check in. And maybe they say yes. Or maybe they say no. Gently, firmly. And either way, they remain whole. Eventually, without a specific moment or announcement, rebuilding begins. Not the kind that looks like a comeback. Not a grand return to the old self. This rebuilding is quieter, less visible. It doesn't announce itself with declarations or timelines. It begins in small acts, gentle decisions, honest pauses, a slower way of waking up in the morning, a more careful way of spending time. The person doesn't feel fully healed. That's not the goal. In fact, they stop thinking in terms of fixed or broken. Instead, they start paying attention to what feels real, what feels right, what feels sustainable. They no longer rush toward the life they had. They're not interested in returning to the person they were before they broke, because now they understand some things needed to fall apart. This time, they are building something new. They begin with rest, with learning how to enjoy doing nothing, not as avoidance, but as restoration. They discover the beauty of small rituals, drinking tea without distraction, taking walks without headphones, sitting in a room without needing to fill the silence. They learn how to be alone, and then how to like it. They also begin letting joy in again, not forced joy, not the kind you chase to prove you're okay, but simple joys that arrive quietly. A favorite song that feels different now, a meal that reminds them of safety, a laugh that escapes before they can think. These aren't signs that the pain is gone. They're signs that the heart is still alive. With this aliveness comes a new kind of awareness of their limits, of their needs, of how much energy certain things take. They become more selective, not out of bitterness, but out of kindness to themselves. They stop over-explaining. They stop trying to convince people to understand them. They let some people misunderstand, and they realize that's okay. They don't owe the world their constant availability. They don't need to be constantly understood to be valid. They're learning to exist without overperforming. And that's a kind of freedom they've never felt before. And in that freedom, they start creating again. Not just in artistic ways, though some do find their way back to painting, writing, singing, but in the broader sense, they create their schedule, their habits, their responses. They start saying things they once kept hidden. They start dressing the way they've always wanted to. They create friendships that feel like home, not obligation. They slowly shape a life that doesn't just look good on the outside, but feels honest on the inside. Sometimes they look back, at who they were before they broke. And it's strange, bittersweet. They feel gratitude. That version of themselves was trying their best, surviving, loving, holding it all. But they also feel sadness. That version had no idea how much more there was to life beyond the struggle, how much softness was possible. And now they carry both, gratitude for the self who endured, and love for the self they're becoming. There's no final chapter here, no finish line, but there's peace. A peace that doesn't require perfection. A peace that lives in the acceptance of what was, and what is. And in that peace, they begin to trust again. Not everything, not everyone, but enough. Enough to keep going. Enough to open their heart again, carefully. Enough to believe that maybe, just maybe, breaking wasn't the end of them, but the beginning of something truer. And so, the rebuilding continues, not always smoothly, not without fear, but with intention, with clarity, with courage, and perhaps most of all, with softness. Good night.